Hello everybody, in this video I'm going to show you how to ace the APCSP Create task. We've helped a lot of people in our classes score really highly on this test through use of practice create tasks, and I'm hoping that we can do the same for you. So let's get going. The first and most important thing is the APCSP Create task is not about how cool your code is. It's about how well you answer their questions. So this Pong game that I'm showing right here, it's super great, but it is not necessarily great for the APCSP Create task. So what I'm going to show instead is how you can follow formulas in answering the questions to score highly almost every time. Instead of this cool Pong game, I'm going to show you how to apply these formulas to my fortune wheel game, which is a bad imitation of the Wheel of Fortune game show. And in doing so, I'm hoping you're going to ace this portion of your exam. For 3A1, we're asking you just follow the formula. The overall purpose of the program is something. This can be a really short answer. There is a word count, so you want to be sure that you're saving your words for the other questions. And this is how I answered it. I wrote that the overall purpose of the program is to play a single-player version of the Wheel of Fortune game. For 3A2, again, just follow the formula. The functionality of the program demonstrated in the video is and something. This answer is going to be a little bit longer than the answer for 3A1, and that's normal. In my case, I write about what happens, I guess H, and it shows up. I guess X, and it doesn't show up, and then I solve the puzzle. For 3A3, once again, follow the formula. The formula is, the input is via something. So it's going to be the keyboard, mouse input, microphone input, file input, something like that. And it is something, so be specific about what it is. The output is via, and again, pick one of them. Print to screen, graphics to screen, speaker, file output, and the output is something. So just follow that formula and everything will be fine. So the one thing you want to remember here is that the input needs to cause the output. In other words, it gives this output because I gave it this input. In my example, the input is via keyboard and it's me typing in that I want to guess and solve. Other inputs are my letter guesses and my solve guesses. The output is via printout to screen and is the result of my guess and solve attempts. The second point is about creating and using a list. This point is covered in questions 3B1, 3B2, 3B3, and 3B4. Most people end up getting this point. For 3B1, you want to show how the list comes into existence. So this list could be empty, it could be filled, it doesn't matter, you just have to show how it comes into existence. You could also use a dictionary if you prefer. In my program, I'm going to define a list of money values, so this is basically what you might spin if you spin the wheel on Wheel of Fortune. For 3B2, you'll want to show the list being used. It needs to be the same list that you used in 3B1. And if you want to score 0.3, you need to have it be so that programming the code with the list is some sort of win over programming the code without the list. I'll go over this more in detail later on. Examples of list usages that could win this point include picking a random item from a list, appending to a list, using a different list method like sort or reverse, picking an item from a list using a number, and iteration, but not always iteration. Iteration if you don't know how many items are in the list. In my example, I pick a random item from a list, which simulates the spinning of the wheel and coming up with a random dollar amount. 3B3 is super easy, you just have to write the name of the list. So my list is named spin values. 3B4 is also super easy, you have to say what the data in the list represents. So the data in my list represents the dollar amounts somebody who spun the wheel could potentially earn for a correct letter. The third point is about having your list manage complexity. In other words, there needs to be a win or some sort of gain in efficiency for using this list. So this point is covered in question 3B5. So here, once again, you're just going to follow the formula and really just write, this list manages the complexity of something. If I wrote the code without the list, something. And really the question is, what do you fill in? Well, that kind of depends on what you answered for 3B2. But mostly, they follow a cookie cutter approach and are transferable between projects. I'll go over more examples of this in a separate video later on, but for now, I'm just going to do the one for my code right here. So this is my code. I'm picking a random item from a list of numbers. This is a simulation of spinning the wheel. If I want to change my code to add more spin values, I would only have to change my list, one line. The rest of the code would be unchanged. I don't need to know exactly how many items I'm spinning over because I'm calculating the length of the list. So my code is very, very easy to maintain. So keep that in mind. It's easy to maintain. This right here is what my code would look like without the list. And I'm putting them side by side so you can see. I'd have to have a big if, elif, else block to do exactly the same thing. And this if, elif, else is huge. I didn't even write the whole thing out. So here's what's important. This list is going to give me 2 wins. The first win is that my code with lists is better with respect to the complexity of readability and length. The if-else's make my code a lot longer without any benefits to readability. In fact, it's less readable. And this problem is going to get worse and worse the more items I have in my list. The second win is that my code with lists is better with respect to the complexity of code maintenance. As I said just a little bit ago, if I wanted to add more spins, I can change the list, and I don't have to make any other changes to the code anywhere else. So if I wanted to add some spins to the code without the list, I have to change the random number, and I have to add an elif, and it's easy to make a mistake there when you forget to do one or the other. So the code with lists is better with respect to the complexity of code maintenance. So finally, I wrote my answer down. It's super important that you're super clear with how the code would look without the list. In my example, a big elif and having to change the elif every time I added something, that's how it would look. So in my answer here, I actually left out having to change the random number, which I would have to do if I added an item, but I think this gets the point across. There are 2 questions on this entire sheet where you're going to have to use a lot of words to answer them, and this is one of them. This is also one of the most often missed questions. So be sure you use your word count here, and be sure you win the point. The fourth point is about having a function or method and the basics of using it. The AP board calls this a procedure, which is kind of a general term and used less in Python and more in other languages. But really, they're the same thing. A function and a procedure are the same thing. This point is covered in 3C1, 3C2, and 3C3. And most people get this point. For 3C1, you're going to copy and paste your entire function into the blank. So I've given an example answer for the program that I wrote, and here it is. Your function is going to need 3 things. One is a parameter, and depending on the value of that parameter, it's going to make your function go through different paths in the code. I'll go over this again later in the next question. Your function also needs a loop. This can be a for loop or while loop. Then your function needs an if, elif, and an else. A try or except is also okay here. So again, 3 things. Parameter and a for loop or while loop and an if, elif, else. For 3b, you want to copy and paste where you called your function, or in other words, where you used your function. And I've given an example answer for the program that I wrote. For 3C3, you're going to write what your program does and how it fits in with the rest of the program. In other words, why do you need the function and what are you using it for? So for this one, you can just follow the formula. The procedure does blank. The procedure contributes to the overall functionality of the program by blank. And again, in Python, when the AP board says procedure, they mean function. So here's my example from my Wheel of Fortune game. The procedure checks to see if the guess letter is in the phrase. The procedure contributes to the overall functionality of the program by implementing the guessing part of a Wheel of Fortune style game where the object is to guess the correct phrase. And if you think about it, this all makes sense given that I'm programming. The 5th point is about being able to describe your function really well. And it's covered in 3C4. The best way to answer this question is to copy and paste your code into the box and describe it line by line. When I grade practice versions of the create task, a lot of people miss this point. And it's a shame too, because they miss it because they weren't precise enough. Not because they weren't smart enough or anything like that, or they were missing anything in the code, they just weren't precise enough. And I don't want that to happen to you. If you follow this procedure exactly, I'm almost going to guarantee you can get this point. So let me show you how it works. In my first line of code, I have the function and parameters, and so I'm going to describe that. My function is named guess with 3 parameters, and then I describe the parameters. My second line of code, I make a variable, so I write that. I create a variable named counter, and I set it to 0, and then I describe the variable. My third line of code, I made another variable, and I do exactly the same thing. My fourth line of code, I use a for loop, so I mentioned I loop over each letter in my hidden phrase with a for loop, and so on and so forth. And at the end, you end up with an answer that looks kind of like the one that you see here. Answering this question well will use up a lot of your word count. There's no way around that. If you want to for sure get this point, you will have to use a lot of words on this answer. And that's okay. Again, answering this question is really about being careful and precise. But if you are, it's definitely a point that you want. The sixth point is about being able to describe how you can take different paths through your function depending on the values of the parameters. And it is covered in 3D1, 3D2, and 3D3. If you've written your program according to AP specs, then this is in theory easy. But people still miss this question because they didn't understand the question or whatever for whatever reason, and I want to avoid that fate for you. So first, I want to show you what it means to take different paths through a function. In this first example here, my hidden phrase is Happy New Year, and again, this is a Wheel of Fortune type game. My hidden phrase is Happy New Year, and I guess H. So Happy New Year has an H, and so it's in there. So the blue code is going to show the code that is executed. The code's going to check the if. It's going to check to see if the if is in the hidden phrase. And if it is, it'll run the code associated with the if. In the second example, my hidden phrase is still Happy New Year, but I guessed X. And Happy New Year does not have an X. So the yellow shows the code that is executed. And the code checks if the letter's in the hidden phrase, and it is not. So that's different from before. It does the same check, but the result of the check is different. And because of that, it runs the code associated with the else. So that's the architecture your function needs to score this point. So now, on to how we answer the questions. In 3D1, the question I see a lot is people are asking me, do we need to call the function twice in the code? And we asked this because we weren't sure ourselves, and the answer we got was no. You do not need to actually call the function twice in your code, but you need to be able to theoretically call a function in multiple ways so that when you call it, it'll take different paths through that function. Again, depending on the values of your parameters. But you do not need to call a function multiple times in your code. So for 3D1, I recommend just to follow this formula. Paste in your call, but hard code the arguments of the function. And then you describe the call. And these two things will make it obvious to the grader. So in my example, I've written out the call and hard coded the arguments. So my hard coded argument is the H is my guess for the letter. And again, the phrase, the hidden phrase is Happy New Year. Then I describe how they are different. So again, so it's obvious to the grader how they are different. So in the first one, I'm looking for the letter H. And in the second one, I'm looking for the letter X. For 3D2, again, we just want to follow the formula. The condition tested by call 1 is this. The condition tested by call 2 is that. And this condition is always going to be either an if or an elif, which makes the function run different parts of the code depending on the value of your input parameters. So let's look at an example. In mine, the condition tested by call 1 is if the letter H is the same as the letter I'm currently on. And the condition tested by call 2 is if the letter X is the same as the letter I'm currently on. And in this example, we are testing the same line of code. The only difference is our variables have different values. So again, in both cases, we are testing the if. If your code has an elif, you will be testing different lines of codes and different conditions. For 3D3, you can again just follow the formula. The first call, blank, and then you say what the result is. The second call, blank, and you say what the result is. Does it set a variable to a certain value? Maybe it prints the screen, outputs to a file. Maybe it outputs to a speaker. Just fill in the blank. So, in my example, my first call prints and changes the values of two variables. And in the second call, it just prints. So these should be different things, but all you got to do is fill in the blanks and you can get this point. And that's it. If this video was helpful to you, please give it a like and subscribe. And let me know if you have any suggestions or thoughts in the comments below. Alright, thank you very much.